good afternoon, good day for all of you for joining us in this second pilot from the UK Centre of Excellence in Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation. I just want to, as a host, introduce very briefly to what the UK CEiRSI is, and then hand over to Mark and the team who have been working very diligently in putting together this case study for discussion today. So the UK Centre of Excellence on In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation is a community effort that is providing a number of activities, among those training webinars that are supported by Innovate UK, the Medical Research Council, or MRC, and the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agents, or MHRA. And as the UK's first centre on its kind, we pioneer the use of in-silico methods to enhance regulatory science and innovation. And our webinars will delve into the latest advancements in the area, try to identify and share best practices, and also contribute to the understanding and demystifying of the in-silico technology through exemplars of both the technologies, but also of their application. And what we hope with this is to foster collaboration and knowledge sharing among all of the stakeholders that drives progress in healthcare and medical research. So we hope that you join us in exploring this future of regulatory science. I want to say thanks as well to Lara Higham, who is kindly supported the development of a lot of these webinars, on the background, and she will make sure as well that you get through the chat access to a number of resources that we are making available. The webinars and all the previous webinars are deployed eventually in our YouTube channel, which we recommend that you explore if you miss any of the previous events. And this is the second of a series of 10 webinars specifically dedicated to dissect, explore, and understand in depth very concrete case studies in detail, or at least in some detail, let me put it that way. And there will be a first part where you will be presented the case study by the group that has done all the preparation work, but then in a subsequent part, there will be the opportunities for you to put forward questions, critiques, recommendations, maybe establish also parallelisms between this area and other relevant areas where your work falls, or try to look at some of the things that will be presented through the optics of your own experience as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mark Horner from ANSYS, who also is going to be introducing the rest of the team. Thank you.
So as Alex mentioned, we're the Pilot 6 team. And in this case, we're going to talk about a verification and validation study that's associated with spinal pedicle screw systems. So in just a moment, you'll hear, in case you don't know what that means, you'll hear all about it and learn a little bit about those devices and how they work and how they're assessed. And then we'll take you through a validation study where we were able to use computational modeling and simulation to justify one element of the mechanical performance of that system using modeling and simulation. Okay, and ultimately the goal was to answer a regulatory question of interest that's associated with the mechanical performance of those devices using the model. Now, Alex mentioned the team, so I'm really grateful to all the different team members. Not everyone here will present today, but they're all really helpful and impactful in terms of developing this case study. So I definitely appreciate the contribution from everyone on developing the content that you'll see. In terms of the agenda for today, we'll start off with an overview of rod screw implant systems, and that's coming from Shren. The business case study will come from Steve, so he'll discuss a little bit of justification around the modeling and simulation. And then the credibility planning, execution, and assessment piece will come from me. Ashley from MHRA will provide some discussion around regulatory impact. I will provide conclusions, and then we'll go into the Q&A discussion that Alex mentioned. And so with that, Shren, I'm going to turn things over to you. So just tell me if next slide when you're ready, and I'll kind of scroll through your presentation. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to CEiRSI for inviting us to present on this collaborative effort. It's been a long time we've worked on this. I think Mark and I were kind of joking the other day. It was almost a decade from when we actually started this. So we're really happy to present kind of the final results of the study. So, as Mark mentioned, the focus of the study was on spinal pedicle screw systems. Those that aren't familiar with this device type, pedicle screw systems are indicated for patients with the pathologies that are listed here. And they manifest in patients, specifically, as back pain. And so these systems are used as an adjunct for spinal fusion. They consist of several components. You can see that on the images there on the right side of the screen. The main parts of the pedicle screw system are the pedicle screws themselves, and you can see that there, as well as the rods. Those are kind of the load-bearing element, the main load-bearing element of a pedicle screw system. And they're implanted in the posterior spine, so in the back there of your spine, and it stabilizes that area of the spine to allow for fusion of the two vertebrae. These pedicle screw systems are generally considered as Class 2 devices by the US FDA, and a 510(k) pathway is used for authorization. And within that 510(k) paradigm, mechanical testing is a really important part of this authorization process. And the FDA has outlined the mechanical testing that's recommended in the guidance document, as you can see there in the bottom right. Next slide, Mark. So the common mechanical testing flow for pedicle screw systems is the use of an ASTM standard. It's ASTM F1717. And the setup is shown in the image there on the right. You can see where the vertebra are simulated with these plastic blocks. Those are the white blocks you can see there. And the pedicle screws are inserted, two on the top there you see, and then two on the bottom. They're inserted into those plastic blocks. And then the rods connect the two blocks. So those are the longitudinal elements that you see in that image. The testing paradigm there consists of both static and dynamic tests, and in different loading modes. Compression bending testing, so that would be from the top fixture that you can see there, it would push down and provide a compression bend to the system, as well as torsion testing, so that would be rotation of this. And so that would be simulating different loading that you would see in your spine, where you would twist your torso or twist your head, as well as the bending and the compression that you would see from daily activities such as walking and things like that. So in 2011, 2012, an interlaboratory study was conducted. It was organized by what's now Zimmer Biomet, or ZimV actually now. And they had 6 laboratories participate using the exact same construct. And what they found was that there was good repeatability within labs and reproducibility between the labs for the different properties that are called out in the standard. So stiffness is one, yield is another. Next slide, Mark. So we organized this collaborative effort, and it included the US government and industry to understand how well computational modeling can simulate a standard method for mechanical testing of pedicle screw systems. And this is particularly given how robust the experimental method was, as I mentioned about the interlaboratory study for this standard method. So we broke up this study into kind of 4 different areas that we wanted to look at. So first, we wanted to perform an interlaboratory FEA simulation. So we had different modeling laboratories simulate the 1717 method to understand how that variability existed within the simulation. As we've already seen, there was an experimental interlab study, but now we were looking at the computational side of this. And we also wanted to, perform the validation study, which is compare the FEA with experimental results, and then take that a step further and really try to understand what the influence of the input parameters on the mechanical response of the system. So we did a sensitivity analysis and an uncertainty quantification sub-study. And then, overall, we wanted to establish the best practices and credibility criteria for using computational stress analysis in pedicle screw systems. Next slide, Mark. So before we started on the pedicle screw systems and those objectives, the initial phase of the study followed the hierarchical validation approach that decomposes the complete system into subsystems, benchmark cases, and components. And so for our case, the complete system is the full pedicle screw construct that you see in that image in the top right. And that can be further broken down into subsystems and unit problems. And so if you go to the next slide, Mark, or the next, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay, there you go. So that can be broken down into, the unit problem, which is the spinal rod under bending. So a much simpler case where we're looking at just the rod itself and not, say, the interaction of the pedicle screw with the rod or the interaction of the pedicle screw with the block itself. And so by performing, the V&V process on this simple case, and I'll explain it in the next slide, which it was a 3-point bending of the spinal rod, it increased our confidence that the complete system would result in the correct answer. So, again, as I mentioned, this is a collaboration between industry and the U.S. government. So you can see all the different entities that were involved in this. And this, simpler unit problem involved tensile testing of a spinal. It involved initially the tensile testing of the spinal rod according to ASTM E8 standards. So you can see that on the left. And that gave us our material model or the calibration input. We performed experimental and computational 3-point bending testing and simulation, as you see there on the right. And then we performed the V&V activities that included calculation verification, uncertainty quantification, and that resulted in the paper that we published about 5 years ago. So Steve's going to continue the presentation now and discuss the business case and the considerations regarding moving to an in-silico approach. So I think I'll hand it off to Steve.
Thanks, Srin.
Okay. Thanks, Srin. One thing I'll say, Steve, is as
Yeah.
Srin was kind of guiding me through the presentation, there appears to be just a touch of a lag there. So I'll try and keep up, but there may be a small amount of lag as well. But go
No
ahead.
worries. I'll talk long, so we'll break that up.
Problem.
Awesome. Let's move on to the next slide. So as we think about the business case here, I want to present a scenario, and we're going to walk through this scenario in a way that helps to illustrate at least one circumstance or type of circumstance that could lead to motivation for running these types of studies. I think everybody on this call likely has an inbuilt bias or at least an interest in running these types of analyses. But oftentimes it's got to make, most of the time it's got to make business sense, right? So we got to be able to justify our desire to do this and the value that comes out of running these analyses, particularly as they are not standard at the time in the field. So the scenario I want to put forth is what you see on the screen here, and it's basically a situation where a manufacturer has a cleared system using a solid screw. So they've already gone through this process. There's an artificial timeline on the bottom there, just kind of laying out what this might look like. They've got a system on the market. However, clinical trends and techniques and motivations have emerged after getting that device cleared that would favor a cannulated screw. There's a variety of reasons why that might be the case, but let's just propose that clinicians are asking for it, and there's at least a marketing motivation for developing this. So the engineering team, the business leaders propose a new design, pretty simple, just put a hole down the screw, but to cannulate the screw and think through what the regulatory path and business path might be there. So management at this point, has a question to answer. Essentially, do they want to go through the existing pathway where maybe they do some F1717 testing to justify the performance of the product with the alteration, or maybe they want to go to a route that includes modeling and simulation. So the big question of interest from a business perspective, to use that language, is whether modeling and simulation offers a compelling business advantage for a variety of reasons, two of which we'll focus on, for the updated pedicle screw system. So on the next slide, we'll go through a framework of how we might think about this. And there's a variety of different questions to address, and this is very, very high level. So I want to be very clear about that. But as we think through the application of modeling, and I'm hoping that this framework, and I believe that this framework does apply in most circumstances. But as we think through this, there's really three questions in my mind that we need to address. One, do we need to get clinical data? Assuming that's not the case, then we want to move on to this next question in the middle here of whether available modeling approaches can credibly assess the required design requirements for the product. So some details there in terms of credibly assessing it, but we want to make sure that the approaches that are available to us and are understood in the field are appropriate for whatever the concern is, right? Can we model it? And then the last question on the bottom right there is whether then, if that's the case, that we can model it, the cost and the time to market impacts are favorable for the particular scenario we're looking at. So, fundamentally, I think in many circumstances breaks down to, do we need clinical data? Can we run the model in a way that gets us the right type of information credibly? And if so, what's the business impact in the decision-making process? On the next slide, we'll look through or think big picture about our particular example here. In this scenario where we're just thinking about a screw with a hole through it, a cannulated screw, there's no clinical requirement for these devices typically. And Ashley will go into much more detail in terms of the considerations from a regulatory perspective. And certainly if there's questions, we should have those conversations. But for the purposes of this discussion, no clinical requirement. Furthermore, from the perspective of the change, the mechanics at play here are relatively straightforward. We're really just going for the static performance of the updated screw. We're not thinking about complicated things like fretting or wear or things of that nature, which maybe not you can handle. But in this particular circumstance, I think the answer is pretty straightforward, obviously, that we can run the model and we can get the right type of outputs that are relevant for our design considerations. So then we get to this red box where the question is, these two things that we've posed here are the direct cost and the time to market impact of the simulation activities and the credibility activities going to be favorable for our particular circumstance. On the next slide, we'll talk about the direct cost implications. So we're going to break this up into two different halves. We'll do the direct cost and we'll talk about time to market. When we think about direct cost and acknowledging that these numbers are essentially made up, but roughly the right order of magnitude likely for much of this. We're really trying to compare here the traditional approach, i.e. F1717 testing alone, so not using any modeling and simulation evidence, against the simulation approach. And the conclusion, as we see at the bottom there, is, in this scenario posed, the direct costs likely favor the testing. This is a little bit of a handicap. We'll talk about this in a little bit here. But the assumptions in our approach here are that you've already done some traditional testing, so you have the infrastructure in place to do that testing. And in contrast, from a simulation perspective, you do need to do some of these credibility activities up front. So you need to get the modeling that maybe you've done from an R&D perspective, but now you're trying to get it up to regulatory grade modeling evidence. There's some additional activities such as the validation testing and credibility stuff that Srim was talking about before and Mark will talk about next. Regardless, we're going to pose that the direct testing favors or is a cost-effective approach here relative to simulation. Now, that's just the direct cost, though. However, obviously, we do need to think about the time to market impact. So in this circumstance, again, with the numbers being arbitrary, they're not specific to a particular scenario, but we think that they're roughly realistic. When we're thinking about the time that it would take to pursue a traditional approach, we're going to estimate that timing at about 3 months. In contrast, we're going to estimate the timing for the simulation at about 1 month. So we're really cranking those machines. We're getting that work done pretty quickly. And we're going to conclude that we have a approximately 2-month time to market advantage for the simulation. Bunch of assumptions there, but let's just go with it for the time being. So if we have a 2-month time to market advantage, how does that translate into dollars or pounds in the case here? So on the next slide, we've got a bit of a description and a plot of potential cost implications here. So given that the simulation is affording us an extra 2 months time to market, we want to think about the financial impact of that earlier time to market. And this is specific for this particular product scenario. There's a number of assumptions on the right there, but the primary financial impacts are, one, there's a direct benefit of earlier market access with your premium products. So you've added some features, presumably you're going to be able to sell it for a little bit more, and you're also going to increase your market share, which is the second primary benefit. So we've got in that chart some numbers that are supported by the assumptions on the right there, which are UK specific. But the basic idea, and what I want to draw attention to, is the dashed line, which is the cumulative revenue difference under these assumptions between the two scenarios, where nominal is the traditional testing and the early market access is leveraging simulation to get out there earlier. You see over those first couple of months, you have a large cumulative revenue difference when you have that early market access, which really emphasizes the benefit of getting onto the market quickly. The subsequent advantage after 2 months in this scenario is reduced because we're assuming that competitors get their products to market at that time. Regardless, though, we still end up, again, with these assumptions for UK only at about 200,000 pounds of difference there, which is pretty significant, and it more than overcomes the direct cost difference that we proposed or suggested would be the case a few slides ago. And of course, one important note here, we got those assumptions there, but this is just the UK market. If we think about the worldwide market, or we think about some larger markets like the US and the EU, obviously these numbers are going to be multiplied. I was looking at some numbers that suggested that spinal procedures in the UK might be 1% or so of the worldwide total. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but if that's the case, then these numbers might be very significant. But ultimately, we have this time market benefit, which, based on these numbers, overcomes the direct cost disadvantage of simulation. The further advantage, though, on the next slide that we'll talk about, and there's various ways to describe this, but if you think about a flywheel effect, essentially, in our prior example, we have handicapped the simulation severely because we're assuming that the testing infrastructure was already in place, but we needed to develop the modeling infrastructure to a significant extent. Every subsequent activity, though, from modeling perspective, is going to be able to leverage the credible infrastructure that you've developed for modeling in this initial step. Therefore, you'd have a flywheel type effect where future design changes can benefit directly from this validated workflow. And ideally, you're able to further increase the time to market advantage, which I think is a legitimate case here, as well as the direct costs come down significantly if you don't have to do some of those credibility activities that Srin was talking about and that Mark will talk about when I kick it over to him now.
All right, thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. Yeah, nice study there. And yeah, just highlighting, I think you said it as well, but when we look at those dollars, think about scaling that out across, multiple geographies and not just limiting that benefit to UK. Suddenly those numbers become really large. Okay, so now we'll move on to the section where I talk about the credibility planning, execution, and assessment. So this is the work that was actually performed to do the verification and validation of the computational model that we developed and ultimately answer the question of interest around this iterative design problem that we wanted to analyze using simulation. So just as a quick reminder, I assume most of you on the phone are familiar with the V&V-40 process, but just to put put one graphic here as a reminder, the V&V-40 process is a step-by-step. What the V&V-40 standard provides is a step-by-step process for establishing the credibility requirements of a computational model, right? So we start off with a question of interest that we want to answer, presumably using a model. And then we go into a planning phase, an execution phase, and an assessment phase. So I'll go through each one of these phases individually and show you the work that we performed. In this case, in relation to that iterative design change that Srin was talking about before. And so our question of interest here is as follows: what we stated was, does introducing a 1.6 millimeter diameter cannulation to an existing 7.5 millimeter diameter pedicle screw compromise the mechanical performance of the rod screw construct? Okay, so we have original design here. That's the screw on the middle of the slide, and hopefully you can see my mouse. And then in the bottom right, you can see this kind of channel running down the middle of that screw, and that's the cannulation that we've introduced to the system. Okay, and on the left, this is just a picture of the ASTM F1717 standard and the testing that we're required to perform. So for context of use, when it comes to context of use, so now we're going into planning those credibility activities associated or as outlined by the V&V-40 standard. We need to define the specific role and scope of the model, include a statement of what will be modeled and how the outputs will be used to answer the question of interest, and also include a description of other supporting evidence that would be involved potentially when answering that question. And so specifically for our study, our context of use is that model predictions of the original non-cannulated screw construct will be validated with benchtop testing, right? And so Srin already took us through the kind of a little bit of description of that static compression bending test. The validated model framework will be used to evaluate the cannulated screw design undergoing identical test conditions, and no benchtop testing of the cannulated screw design will be performed to answer the question of interest. So really, it's only the computational model here that's going to help us understand the performance of this new construct design under static compression bending. Okay, so that's an important takeaway. And so the next step then in the V&V40 process is to assess model risk. So on the left-hand side, we describe what is risk, and that's the possibility that the use of the computational model could lead to a decision that results in patient harm, or there are other adverse impacts. It could be business impacts like delayed time to market, right, that Steve was talking about. There could be other impacts that are related maybe to the clinical procedure itself. Maybe there's, somehow through poor designing, it's very difficult to, implant the system into patients, et cetera. So there's a variety of negatives that can come up if we have a poor design. When it comes to the model risk itself, it's a combination of two things: model influence and decision consequence. So on the right-hand side, first I'll talk about model influence, which is the contribution of the computational model relative to other contributing evidence when answering the question of interest, right? And we already talked about how on the last slide, the simulation results are the only source of evidence that we're going to use to answer that question. So in this case, our model influence is high. And so this is a screenshot from the V&V40 standard, which shows, the different choices that you have when deciding on model influence. And so what we're saying here is that simulation outputs from the model are a significant factor in the decision. This next slide then talks about decision consequence, and that's the significance of an adverse outcome as a result of an incorrect decision based on the model, right? So in this case, we did a little bit of research in the peer-reviewed literature. And what we found is that, screw fractures can happen. They can either be asymptomatic typically, or in some cases may require the need for revision surgery because of pain. That said, typically patients aren't going to encounter, a severe injury or death. So how we ranked the decision consequence in this case was medium. So an incorrect decision could result in minor patient injury or the need for physician intervention, or there are other impacts. So when we bring these two different risk factors together, then what we have is an overall high medium risk for the computational model. Okay. And so if you haven't seen the V&V40 standard before, this is our kind of risk assessment graphic that we have within the standard that brings together the impact of model influence and decision consequence into an assessment of the overall model risk. So ultimately then we have this high medium model risk. And as I mentioned earlier on, the V&V40 standard provides us with a risk-informed credibility assessment framework. So essentially now what we're going to do is see how risk guides the credibility requirements for our computational model. So when we talk about credibility, what we're referring to is trust in the predictive capability of the computational model for the context of use, and that trust can be established through the collection of evidence. And so what we did within the V&V40 standard, I'm going to zoom up on one portion of the slide, is to identify what are called credibility factors. And these credibility factors are the constituent elements of verification and validation. Another way to think about this is these are individual studies that you have to perform to show that the model is sufficiently credible. And you can see they span a wide range of activities. They range from software quality assurance to code verification to mesh refinement studies to evaluations of the computational model form, as well as the evaluation of the comparator that we're using for validation. And then there are also credibility factors associated with the applicability of the computational model to the context of use and to the context of use. And so, essentially what I'll do for the rest of this presentation is take you through the work that we did to assess those credibility factors. Now, before I do that, I did want to give you an example of the relationship between risk and the credibility factors themselves. So within the V&V40 standard, for each credibility factor, what we provide is a description of that credibility factor. So what's the kind of information or kind of study that we want you to perform when investigating that element of credibility. And then the next step then is the suggested gradation of activities from low to high risk. Okay. And so this is where that risk connection comes into play, when it comes to establishing credibility of your model. So for low risk scenarios, you might say, oh, for code verification, I'm just going to ignore it. Just doesn't matter. I'm using a commercial code. A lot of people use it. Probably doesn't have any bugs. It's fine, right? On the side of high risk, you might have to go through what's called an order of accuracy assessment of the computational software itself. So I'm a chemical engineer. I do a lot of computational fluid dynamics. One of the settings that we can use within a CFD tool is what's called second order upwinding. And what that means is that, for example, if you're solving a laminar flow problem, the solution should converge at a second order rate as you refine the mesh. Okay, so it should converge converge that analytical solution if you have one, or the final converged solution if you're doing a standard mesh refinement study for discretization error. That rate of convergence should be very fast. And so we can make a comparison between that convergence rate and the actual convergence rate that expected by the settings, and see if you actually meet that. And if you don't, that means you may have encountered a bug or some weakness in numerical algorithms associated with the solver. In between low and high are other things that you can do, and those are in the kind of medium risk category. Okay. So then what this chart shows then is the credibility factor table that I showed you a couple slides back, but now we've expanded a little bit to include the credibility levels from the V&V 40 standard. One thing you may notice is that some credibility factors have 3 levels and some have 4, and there's even one with 2 credibility levels. And so the reason we're showing this chart is that with our high medium risk category, in this case, if we were able to achieve for the factors that have 3, for the credibility factors with 3 levels, if we can achieve B in terms of our gradation, and if we can achieve C for the gradation for the ones with 4 credibility factors, and for the isolated one that only has 2 credibility factors, if we can again achieve B, then presumably our model will have sufficient credibility out of the box, right? What you'll see is that we're going to exceed medium high for some of these credibility factors in our study, but there are going to be some that fall short. And so how we manage that and how we handle that is very important. And so we'll talk about that as I go through the credibility assessment part of this presentation. Okay, so now let's move on to credibility activities themselves. So we finished our credibility planning. Let's move on to the credibility activities and some of the work that we did. I'm not going to go through everything. We really did an end-to-end example and addressed every single credibility factor within the V&V 40 standard. I'm just going to highlight a few of those for you here. The first one is code verification. And so I'm going to actually cover the software quality assurance and numerical code verification credibility factors on the next couple of slides. Now, when it comes to software quality assurance, this does introduce some challenges when you're dealing with commercial codes, and that's because we don't have access. We're not the developer. We don't have access to the source code. And so we're really not sure how that code is being developed. So in that case, the things that we can do to ensure the quality of the development processes, how bugs are managed within by that commercial vendor, also how training is performed, et cetera, all those can be assessed through things like release notes of the solver. Every commercial code manufacturer nowadays has a running list of the bugs that have been identified within the code. There's also an ISO 9001 certification document that most of the commercial vendors are also following now. So the ISO 9001 certification essentially then assures that the code developers through an independent assessment are following best practices when it comes to things like code check-in, code checkout, reporting of bugs, trainings, et cetera. So these are the kinds of things that we assessed, each of the modelers assessed within this study to ensure that there was sufficient quality in the codes that were being used. And so in this case, from a V&V 40 perspective, this is a screenshot of the SQA credibility factor, and we achieved a level of C based on what was provided within the standard. Next step then is numerical code verification. And so in this case, what we want to do is really zero in on the elements of the code that we will be accessing as part of our numerical study, right? So software quality assurance is kind of a global assessment of how that code is being developed and managed. In this case now, we want to really, as I mentioned before, zoom in and look at the specific physics that we're going to utilize as part of our study, and then evaluate that and make sure that it's performing correctly. So all the modelers on the team, so there are 3 different groups that were running the verification validation studies. They all did comparisons against benchmark problems. There is plasticity that occurs within the rods as the over the course of the compression bending test. So we evaluated that using the element type test. And then also because bending is a primary mode that we see in terms of, the response of the system when it's under compression. So the rods encounter, a significant amount of bending, and the cantilever beam problem kind of is a nice replicative of that phenomenon. And so we do, on the verification benchmarks, we do conduct mesh convergence tests. And so in this case, we were able to show convergence to a known analytical solution for the cantilever beam problem. So you see that here. It converges very quickly. So you see the element counts going up very quickly from just a few hundred to several thousand. But we see agreement between, the computational model and that expected analytical solution very quickly. Also, one thing that we looked at as part of the verification was different element types. One thing that's important to highlight here is that the element type that you assess during your numerical code verification activities should mirror the element type or types that are being used as part of your validation study. So we could look at a variety of different element types, but in the end, as part of our final study, at least with the ANSYS example, was that solid 187 element types were used, right? So we really need to perform our code verification using this type. If you want to look at other element types, or if you have a mix of element types, then you may need to look at other element types as well. But in the end, it's really important that you do the verification study with the final element type that was used, in the validation study itself. And so in this case, we quantify our discretization error, compare to an exact solution, et cetera. So we feel like from a perspective of numerical code verification, we hit that level C from a V&V 40 perspective. Now moving on to the validation, there are a variety of assessments that were related to the model form, right? So these are the different ways you can set up the computational model. What selections did you make in terms of contact? Looking at friction versus frictionless type contact, et cetera. So a number of different elements were assessed here. Of course, we're simulating the F1717 test. I think Shren did a good job describing that, so I don't need to go through that again, just to show there's a comparison between the in vitro test that's being performed in the lab and then the model, one of the representations of the computational model is shown in the middle. When it comes to model form, some folks use the full 3D geometry to perform the virtual test in silico. Others assume symmetry. There really is no reduction in the amount of information you get. It was just one of those modeler choices that could be made as part of the study. Also, a really interesting comparison that was made was the material model that was used for the rods themselves. So Shren mentioned that an E8 test was performed, and that gave us the stress strain response for the material. Two of the teams used a multilinear curve to represent the stress strain curve. Andy Bauman at FDA used a bilinear model, and he said, well, that's something that he sees quite often. It's also something that's used maybe by less experienced modelers to capture the kind of multilinear type curves. So he just wanted to kind of get a handle for it. One, do something a little bit different, but also get a handle for, how does that impact the potential predictive capability of a computational model when you make that assumption. As I mentioned before, we also looked at different element types and also performed a mesh refinement study. So all that was done as well. And then also Galina Laughlin from DePuy also did a really nice study looking at different settings when it came to, how we manage the contact between the blocks and the screws, the rods and the screws. Do we include threads on the screws? Are the screws bonded to the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene box? Do we introduce friction or frictionless, et cetera? So really kudos to Galina for some really nice work here, helping us understand, the different driving factors when it comes to the model form. So in this case, coming back to V&V 40 and the credibility factors, we felt like we achieved B because we did a pretty extensive evaluation of expected key model form assumptions. Certainly didn't look at every single thing, but I feel like we got pretty close in terms of the different elements of the model form that were investigated. Next one is quantification of sensitivities. This is another interesting study that we did, especially, the next step, which is the quantification of uncertainty, which I think is something we don't see as often within the peer-reviewed literature in the medical device community. So in this case, for quantification of sensitivity, what we did was we first started off with a long list of input parameters of the computational model, things related to geometry, material properties, boundary conditions, et cetera. We went on that list down based on expert judgment. and ultimately landed on these 4 driving parameters that we felt like were the top ones to use for our sensitivity analysis, right? The next thing we did was to perform those 4 model input parameters around plus or minus 1 standard deviation. This is something that is often discussed within our community. We've had long discussions about it within V&V40, and I think the general scientific community as well. I think something you often see with sensitivity studies is that folks will vary the parameters plus minus 10%. And that can be misleading in that it doesn't capture the actual variation that you see in your system. So one thing we really like to highlight within our study and in general as a best practice is that you want to be able to quantify that standard deviation that you're seeing in the actual populations of the tests that you're performing, and then incorporate those into your sensitivity study. And you definitely need that within your uncertainty study. So an uncertainty study based on plus minus 10%, I'm not even sure what the meaning of that would be. Okay. So we perturbed 4 model input parameters. You see the results on the right-hand side. We assessed that for different quantities of interest. We can see that diameter was obviously something that was very important when it came to the sensitivity. Also span and moment arm were 2 of the more critical factors. The material model didn't seem to have a major contribution when it came to sensitivity. In terms of V&V40 credibility factors, we hit a level of B. Sensitivity analysis on expected key parameters was performed. Now moving on to the uncertainty quantification, what we did here was to perform a full Monte Carlo. That was based on then 3 of the input parameters to the model. So we eliminated the material properties as something that was contributing significantly to the uncertainty, and I think that was justified based on what you saw on the prior slide. So then this, I think in the end we ran, it was somewhere in the range of high 20 to 32 simulations was what was required to estimate the uncertainty in the force displacement curve. But that accounted again for the observed variability that we see in these input parameters. So plus minus 1 standard deviation, we run those simulations, and that gives us the uncertainty across the entire force displacement curve. So we're calculating that, as the simulation progresses. This was an interesting one in that within the V&V40 standard, looking at the credibility factors, it was a bit of a mix and match. So we did perform uncertainty analysis on key inputs. They were identified and quantified, but then we propagated that to quantitatively assess the effect on the simulation results. So for whatever reason, when we were writing up V&V40, we kind of eliminated this combination of the beginning of B and the end of C. So I think this is one where credibility factor, I mean, really within the community, you have, the credibility factors themselves, the gradations within the credibility factors aren't locked down. That's always something that we've said within the V&V40 standard was adjustable, and you could customize it to your specific situation. And that was for 2 reasons. One was because, we were laser focused on bench testing within V&V40 and really laying out a framework that would explain how to do risk-based, assessment of computational models. And the way to make that tractable was to focus on something that was timely and relevant for industry, which is bench testing. But we also did recognize that there are other scenarios out there where you might want to use the computational model, maybe for patient-specific simulation and in-silico clinical trial, et cetera. And many of these credibility factors would have to be adjusted. So we do say within the standard over and over again, these are suggested gradation of activities, right? So you do have the freedom to make adjustments yourselves. That said, for this credibility factor, I think it makes sense to just make it a 4-level A, B, C, D, and we could introduce C being kind of the mix of B, the beginning of B and end of C. Okay, so now we have completed our credibility activities, and here's our fully executed credibility plan. So this is the chart that I showed you maybe 15 slides ago. And now what it's giving you is a summary of the work that was performed and how, essentially for each different credibility factor, how far did we go? Okay, so you see for many of these, we're hitting kind of that high and medium level, but there's a couple where we fall woefully, I guess you could say woefully short. We fell pretty far behind. Certainly we're below even 50%. So why is that? Is that acceptable? Those 2 specific credibility factors were the quantity of test conditions and the range of test conditions. And so what I mentioned way back, I think, again, 15 or 20 slides ago, is that if you do fall short, we need some scientific rationale or justification as to why those investigations did not meet the required level of risk. And so what we have here is a case where within the V&V40 framework for quantity of test conditions and range of test conditions, here are your credibility factors. And for level A, which is what we achieved, it says a single test condition was examined for both of these factors. And so, this is really the reason that we stopped at A was because that's the test that was dictated by the F1717 standard. Only one test condition needs to be executed for the standard. So really doing anything else goes beyond the requirements of the standard. So the point here being that we are in compliance with the ASTM F1717 recognized consensus standard for evaluating these spinal constructs, particularly here around the compression bending. So we are in compliance. And to be in compliance, we only have to perform that single test. Okay, so even though we fall short, we do have scientific rationale or a rationale as to why that is the case. So the last step then for my presentation is the assessment piece. All right, so now we need to go on to assess the credibility of the computational model. There was a FDA credibility guidance document that was published in final form at the end of 2023, and they refer to this as an adequacy assessment. And so what we need to ask here is, does the available credibility evidence support using the model for the context of use given the risk assessment? And so when we assess credibility, we can think about this from two different ways. One is, were the activities performed as a whole adequate? And that's demonstrated by reviewing the credibility factors along the lines of what I showed you on the previous slide, but we're going to expand on that a little bit more in the next slide. And then, are the actual results themselves adequate, right? So coming back to that credibility table that I showed you before, of the 23 credibility factors that we have in V&V 40, 15 of 23 of those met high, medium, or greater. All right, so we're already in a good place. 6 of 23 were at medium. And so this is a really interesting set of factors here, because, we had so many discussions that high medium is like, if you say the bottom of this chart is 0% and the top of this chart is 100%, high medium is like 75%, but B is only 67%. So what do we do with this 8%, right? And so you have some discussion around that and make sure you're comfortable that, some of these are hitting medium, but you're still satisfied that those studies that were performed are sufficient to justify the use of the computational model in the COU. 2 of the 23 credibility factors were at low medium, right? But we already discussed a couple slides ago, how even though they're falling short, we are able to provide rationale for why the work that was performed is acceptable. So sometimes this can happen, but as long as you provide appropriate scientific rationale, then that's okay. Now, we also want to look at the quantitative results and qualitative results of the credibility activities. So on the last slide, we're just kind of looking at the table and the risk and how do we do for each credibility factor and how that relates to risk. But let's look at some data, right? So for the non-cannulated screw models, they showed really good agreement with the experimental data. So here's the force displacement curve on the lower right-hand side and a comparison between the 3 different simulation teams and their FEA results and the experimental data. So we saw a really nice agreement in terms of the different quantities of interest that we have for the computational model. The model did predict the highest stresses at the rod midshaft, and we have a picture of that here, and that is consistent with the experiments. And then finally, we want to answer the question of interest, right? So we have this validated computational model. We've decided that the verification, validation, uncertainty quantification work was acceptable. It's applicable in terms of the quantities of interest that were investigated and their relevance to the context of use. So now we want to go ahead and deploy that model to answer the question of interest. So we have a validated model, and it really didn't predict any big change, between the non-cannulated and cannulated screws. We see maybe some differences here when we're going from the, that kind of elastic to plastic regime in the ANSYS model, but overall, it looks like everything is, we're not seeing a big difference in the mechanical performance when it comes to the compression bending, right? So that's looking at the force displacement curves, but then we also kind of look at the stress distribution in a more qualitative way. If you look really closely, you can see some differences in these contour plots. They obviously use the same, span, the minimum and maximum values for the stresses in here were the same for non-cannulated and cannulated. So you can tease out maybe there are some differences up near the tulip, but overall things are looking pretty similar as well from a qualitative perspective. If you would like, I covered a lot of our study in this presentation just now, but if you would like to learn more, there was a paper that was published in Methods last year, and so definitely invite you to check that out. Also, the simulation files, many of the simulation files, not everything, are available on the Open Science Framework, and that link to those files is available within the paper itself. So if you would like to get some of the simulation files, you can get those through that. So that concludes my element, and now I'll move on to the commentary from Ashley. Thank you everyone for your attention.
Thanks, Mark. A
Yep.
great. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, perfect.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a load of great work shown there, and the detailed considerations that are given to in-silico test methods. So that was really fantastic. I'm not sure I have control of the screen. Would you mind moving to the next slide?
You got it.
Thank you very much. There are several points in the medical device lifecycle where a regulatory body may receive and review in silico evidence. I've included a few of the examples on this slide. To clarify the two types of body relevant to the UK and EU that are mentioned on the slides is competent authority, so that's the MHRA, and they do not approve or certify medical devices. Instead, they designate conformity assessment bodies, such as approved bodies in the UK and in the broader EU system, it's notified bodies who are responsible for certification and approval. However, competent authorities do review all clinical investigations planned for their market. And so in the UK, that would be the MHRA receiving those applications. And these are typically the first in human studies. So at this stage, preclinical evidence is submitted for review by MHRA, and this might include in silico data. In the event of the emergence of a post-market safety concern, in silico evidence is often used by manufacturers to better understand the issue and investigate the root cause from a mechanical perspective at least. And in such cases, competent authorities such as the MHRA may need to assess the credibility of the in silico testing provided. As mentioned earlier, the conformity assessment bodies, they may review in silico data as part of their conformity assessment activities, and typically that is during the review of preclinical technical documentation in order to achieve certification. And so in the context of the case study presented in this session, I've also made the point there that conformity assessment bodies are those who are likely to review the design changes as well. And here, instead of the conventional bench testing, alternative approaches such as in silico testing can be used to support the demonstration that that design change does not significantly affect the safety and performance of the device. Kevin, would you mind if we move to slides?
There you go.
Thank you. And so in the orthopedic field, we know that even minor design changes can lead to unintended consequences. This was one of the drivers behind the regulatory changes to the Medical Device Directive all the way back in 2005, when certain joint replacements were reclassified from Class 2B up to Class 3. As such, it's both encouraged and welcomed for manufacturers to have access to a broader range of methods to demonstrate regulatory compliance. And I appreciate that that is very much what this project is aiming to support. However, there are still some barriers to the widespread adoption of these methods. As with any complex approach, success depends on the clear communication of appropriate use cases, which is what Mark has been doing in his presentation, and an understanding of the methodological limitations, again covered by Mark. And so regulators really must be equipped to interpret in silico results and have the confidence in the data presented to them. This is one of the overarching goals, I understand, of the CEiRSI initiative to build both competence and confidence in the use of these advanced methods. And that obviously includes in silico testing, and with the ultimate aim of us in the regulatory bodies being able to take that evidence on, evaluate it appropriately, and hopefully assess it consistently to support a smooth and simple approval process. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ashley. Music to my ears. I love it. Thank you so much. All right, so now for our concluding slide, we're running a little bit behind, I think, although I think we still have plenty of time for Q&A. But just quickly to summarize the conclusions, here we demonstrated with this end-to-end example how we could use the V&V 40 standard to guide the development of a computational model that could answer a regulatory question around iterative design changes, right? We did not test all the elements of F1717, so kind of a disclaimer on the study that we performed that, you know, we just focus specifically on static compression bending. There's other tests that need to be performed, as Srin mentioned in his introduction. You might use simulation, you might not. I think based on what Steve mentioned, you have to make a choice as to what's appropriate and is there appropriate business impact. So we always want to have that in mind when we're undertaking whatever study, in silico or bench test or what have you. I think it was also nice that we're able to rely on other standards and documents to help in the development of our best practice for this specific use case. So V&V 40 was the overarching guiding principle that told us, okay, how much V&V work do we have to do? But we also relied on standards like V&V 20, which provides a lot of guidance around validation. Also uncertainty quantification and how do we perform Monte Carlo, et cetera. There's FDA guidance that we referred to that talk about credibility of computational models. And then also obviously the ASTM standard that was kind of the nucleus of the work that we performed. So I think it's really nice to see these different documents coming together to provide us with a holistic understanding of the work that needs to be performed, and then how to perform that work, and then how to demonstrate the credibility. So with that, I think we are ready for the Q&A session. I've had my screen up the entire time sharing slides, so I just don't know if we have any questions yet, but I'm excited to see those, and I think we have plenty of time to go through that. So we have about an hour left. So I'm going to go out of the full screen mode and maybe stop sharing for a moment and see what's happening on the Zoom. Stop share. Sorry, there it is. All right, I got used to Zooms. Okay, here we go. Now I'll turn on my camera now. Okay, so I'm going to run into the chat. Okay, so I see in the chat some nice feedback. So Alex, you provided some info. Is there a comment you wanted to make there about what you were putting in the chat? I see.
Yeah, I was just trying to fill in a little bit about the sort of the market size of the UK compared to the US. And there's something like 50,000 spinal surgeries in the UK and something like 9 million or so in the US. Of course, not all of them will be using the device we've talked about, but it just kind of shows you the level of scale there is globally if you compare the US being quite a small part of the market. So the figures that Steve talked through could be scaled up multiple times if we look at just the US market, or even more globally. So it's a significant impact.
Yeah, I just ran the numbers on the old calculator app, and that's 180x in the US versus UK.
Yeah, it's a big potential saving. Yeah, but that does come onto I think there's a question from Jeff.
I was just scrolling down to that one now. I was giving your time there, and now let's see what. Jeff, did you want to make a comment here, or just use it to just let everyone read through this? Is there a comment you had here regarding the business and financial analysis?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Mark?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my comment is I understand the 2-week delta for the testing, but in my experience, it's very hard to trace those sorts of delays finally to real market access, because of all the other things that are going on in parallel that also may be critical path. So I'm interested in the panel's perspective on that. How do you really defend that 2-month assumption in the midst of all the other things that go on during regulatory clearance and launch?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start on that since that was my assumption in there. First of all, I do think that is an assumption. This isn't based on specific case example from manufacturer or anything. So just that sort of high level point. I do think, though, in thinking through this question and the other activities that might be happening at the same time as testing is going on, the example here of a very relatively small change to the device would, I think, relative to the conversation we've had internally, I think that would indicate that there's not going to be as many other parallel path activities going on as what might be the case for an initial submission. So this might be a scenario where we benefit from a relatively small change. We benefit from taking advantage of all the work from a biocomp perspective, everything else, sterility, packaging, et cetera, that would have been done on the initial product before launch for that initial product there. So, I do think, I don't have a straight answer, obviously, with respect to how we would justify those numbers specifically for a new scenario. However, I do think it's important to consider where we've put this analysis relative to a typical business consideration because, again, it's a, for lack of a better word, it's a relatively simple scenario.
Yeah, I feel like, Steve, what
Yeah.
you did was kind of to remind me of the old economics days, and words I don't use very often is ceteris paribus, right? So everything else the same. So you kind of all, it's interesting you brought up sterilization because I could see that introduction of cannulation, meaning something new has to change with sterilization process potentially. I don't know. But yeah, we're kind of locking in and saying, look, we really just want everything else about the process pretty much identical. We're just evaluating, the In-Silico test versus that bench test. And is there an acceleration associated with that, and kind of leaving everything else off the table? I don't know. It seemed fair,
Yeah.
a fair assumption, maybe not absolutely perfect, but possibly okay. I don't know, Jeff, what you think there.
Yeah.
No, I think those are fair points. I appreciate the commentary.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we were thinking just to add, sorry, Payman, is when we're talking about, and this gets back, I think maybe what you're saying is traditional 510K versus special, right? And so, when we were kind of discussing this as a group, at least in the US side of this may be a special 510K, right? For the manufacturing change. And maybe Ashley, what you were getting to with the notified bodies, if there's a change, there's kind of a different, let's say maybe pathway or submission for changes. And so in that case, maybe the critical path is only this, or maybe this and one other thing. But Jeff, your point is very valid, of course, for like a traditional 510K. If there's other aspects to it that would be critical path, then certainly that time to market or that 2 months that we're talking about could certainly be something very different.
But just to
Yeah,
add,
thanks for bringing that up. Yeah,
just
go ahead, Pam.
one thing to add, I think maybe it's a bit overlooked, is not to be the bottleneck. There's a value of not to be the bottleneck, to be the one in terms of the evidence generation part of the process. You don't want to be the bottleneck. If it's testing, if it's so what Jeff is saying absolutely true. So there are other on the supply chain, there's a whole bunch of stuff that that could happen, that it may not be the critical path. But I can tell you that my experience past, if you look at 15 years ago versus now, we are not in a bottleneck anymore. There's a reason for that. It's just that we are using more the simulation.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Jeff, you brought up another point around first principle modeling. Okay, I'm a chemical engineer, but I hear y'all saying words like free body diagram and stuff like that. So maybe a back of the envelope stress analysis is some way to kind of de-risk the computational model and the overall model influence. Is that what you're thinking there?
Yeah, so a little more context, and this is similar to other comments I've made about this use case in the past. The changes that we're considering here really aren't going to be teased out in the test, right? Because the test that was part of this is really looking at the rod rather than the screws. And so I would not go into this, either the analysis or the testing, completely blind on the results. I would come in already with a very strong expectation based on first principles that neither the analysis nor the testing is going to show any meaningful impact. So my question is, in cases where we do have that a priori expectation for whatever reason, is that a way to dial down influence? Is that a relevant contributor to the body of evidence to inform the decision?
So I'm nodding my head, yes. I'm trying to think of how it fits together, but yeah, I'd say yes. So the question is, can a model supplement another model? Because in the end, that engineering analysis would be a model of sorts, correct? It's a back of the envelope calculation.
Everything's a model in the end, right, Mark?
Yeah.
There may not actually be any math associated with this. It may just be a discussion on the mechanics of the system.
Yeah, Jeff, and to that point, I think, one of the things that's really powerful with respect, as these methods is the fact that the analysis itself is going to tell you so much more information than you would get. So you're sort of discussing this with respect to first principles, and you're saying, based on our experience, probably based on some analysis done from an R&D perspective, that the rods are going to be the place of greatest interest, and you understand that that's where the stresses are going to be, et cetera. One of the concepts that we talked about was with respect to when this becomes a significant change, and how much of the diameter needs to be taken away from with a cannulation in order for it to potentially impact the stresses and so forth. And those I think are relevant questions. Even if you know that the rod is going to be the place of interest, I think the important concept for us all to keep in mind is that the simulation is going to give us evidence that this change is not going to introduce a new stress concentration, for instance. So it's valuable because it goes beyond just what the test would be able to show, particularly in that additional information of where, if anywhere, those stress increases are going to come in.
I agree with all that, Steve. Then we have to wrestle with how does the validation evidence extend to confidence in the predictions of the stresses around those features, right? And that becomes then a critical discussion on applicability, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There's just one more thing to note about the 1717 is it's a series of spring in series, so it's a series model. That's why the question is, it does change of stiffness in one. It's not supposed to impact the stiffness on the others. It will not impact the stiffness because they're a series of springs put together, and it's a constant moment on the rod. So, at a basic level, it's you can decouple theoretically the whole thing. So, but there's some nuances that that maybe the simple engineering equations may not be able to capture. The simulation might be able to capture. And as Jeff said, maybe are they in the domain of in the intent of the model or not?
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Payman. Appreciate it. Okay, Alex, did you want to talk about your question? You're next. I think we've covered everything up to this point.
Is Alex like me? I guess.
Yes, Alex Franke. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, I'll read it out, and then if there are questions, I can expand. But I just would like to explore with the panel and with other people if there is a possibility to do, to define an objective as a follow-up from this pilot and this phase of the CEiRSI that would be worth pursuing. And so there are minimum testing requirements, right? Could we find at least some tests that either because they can be reliably replaced by simulations, or because we actually know that the current testing doesn't really give you a lot of real information, and a simulation will give you something slightly different but more useful, that we could consider them to be replaceable one for the other. And with the idea that we could potentially talk, with standardization bodies or with whoever we need to do that, the possibility of giving the manufacturers the option of going either virtual or physical, understanding that both tests were equally valid for compliance purposes, right? So that's the first part. And then, assuming that you all believe is a good idea, then is there a hit list? Is there a first test that we could say, look, we know this has a lot of problems, and a simulation will not give you exactly the same information, but actually will give you something more informative, what that would be, so that we can take that. I'm thinking about the next phase of the CEiRSI. Could we put as a concrete objective to develop that sort of best practice, that minimum simulation requirements that will help the community to move forward in this space?
Thanks, Alex. I mean, I have some ideas for an answer, but I feel like Payman, Jeff, or others, y'all are really in this. Maybe you have a really nice answer you could give around MDDTs, developing standards for In-Silico in parallel with, the in vitro testing? Can we really get away from worst case to truly predicting performance, things like that? So I don't know, Payman or Jeff or someone else, if y'all have some opinion there you'd like to share.
Yeah, Mark, I can offer one. So there is an interesting activity going on within ASTM, right? ASTM is an international standards organization that comes out with a lot of prescriptive methods in orthopedics. That's my space. Historically, they've developed physical test methods, and then a decade or two later, they come up with an in-silico analog to support worst case analysis within that test method. Just recently, they have embarked on developing a new method in parallel, a bench method and an in-silico method in parallel, addressing assessment of contact patterns between metal knee components and polyethylene. Metal polyethylene is the dominant articulation couple within knees. And the effort there, and it remains to be seen if it bears out, but the effort, the intent, is you can follow the test method, or you could follow the in-silico method. Either one would do. And in the process of developing the standard, would also have evidence to demonstrate that both should lead you pretty accurately to the same sort of decision. And so this would become an example where the in-silico aspect of that could become part of a minimum simulation requirement within a submission around total knees.
So can I just react and then perhaps seek others to complement as well? So this is very interesting, Jeff, what you're saying, because it's not about saying one test and the other are equivalent, but are they leading to the same decision? Because ultimately that's what you're interested in, right? But you may have different quantitative markers or quantitative pieces of information that essentially are consistent in the direction that you take from there. Is that kind of the idea behind? And second, can you expand a bit more about who is developing those standards, and to what extent the CEiRSI community, I mean the people who are involved in CEiRSI have already involvement in those, or we could do something to sort of be more engaged directly with them as the next phase. It might be that what we need to do for the next phase is in certain activities not do them alone, but rather put additional manpower and energy to progress some of these initiatives faster, right?
There's certainly overlap between the CEiRSI community and the ASTM community, so there is crosstalk between those. I think for more involvement, the more interesting thing might be, and I think Alex, this is where you're getting with the minimum simulation requirements, is really build out that more comprehensive list. Where really ought we to expect simulation for specific types of devices? Once that list is built out, then we can overlay that with prescriptive standards within ISO or ASTM or others, see where the gaps are in terms of established methods, and then start to pick away at the most important ones.
So Jeff, one question here, and then Alex, I think the way you framed your question, Alex, you say replaceable, right? And so one of the things that I think about is this question about predicting relative performance versus absolute performance. That comes up quite a bit. So relative performance is a rank ordering to identify worst case, which then goes on to testing. So in that case, you're reducing the burden of the physical test, but in the end, you're still using the test to make the final determination, right, about whatever safety performance issue you have. The replaceable means that we're eliminating. I guess there will be validation, right? So there will be some data to validate the model, but ultimately, in the end, we're replacing that test completely. I guess one question I would have is that attainable in the near future, or should we move towards something that says right now, let's try and virtualize, this kind of relative assessments, and then eventually get to the point where we have enough confidence to move into absolute prediction?
So there are definitely advocates on both sides of that fence, Mark. Absolutely. I think you probably know which side I'm on. It's probably the same side as many people on this call. But there are others who really are slow adopters to using simulation as an outright replacement for testing. The interesting thing about this particular work item, though, is across all the different things that we can simulate, this is one where we're going to be pretty darn accurate almost all the time. And so we have a reasonable test bed to have that conversation with the opposition to see if we can get everyone aligned that we can actually replace testing because of the demonstrated accuracy of the method. If finally within the standards organization we don't get there, then the fallback is, as you say, use simulation for worst case determination.
Yep. And then the other thing I think about is, oh, sorry, go ahead. I don't want to monopolize. Was that Payman?
No,
I
go
thought I
ahead,
heard
Mark.
someone chime
No,
in.
I was
Oh,
just
okay.
about to, but go ahead,
I was
please
trying.
finish your thought.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry. The I was trying to guess like on name that tune. Just one little, you went and I was like, oh, is that Payman? I was trying to see if I could do it in one note. All right, but anyway, the other thing I was thinking about is the rapid evolution, right, within ortho. So I hear about standard tests and non-standard tests quite a bit. So Jeff, I hear you talking, yes, positively about the absolute predictions and replacing that in vitro test. Is the innovation rate, maybe it depends on the device type, is innovation rate such that it's not, okay, I'll just say it, it's not worth the investment, right? Or are there some tests that are going to be around for long enough where if we invest that time and resource into establishing the best practice, that, yeah, that absolute prediction is worthwhile?
Yeah, Mark, and I was just going to add, I mean, we also have to understand, like, so where I'm at, and when I was at the FDA, I was looking at orthopedics, cardiovascular, other types of things, and in cardiovascular, of course, we're thinking about replacement. Alex, you had mentioned replacement, right? So one of the things with fatigue, right, is, this also is based on processing, inclusions, and lots of other things that maybe the computational model right now is not able to capture, right? So we have to understand also the limitations right now of currently where we're at with In-Silico. We're not putting inclusions. I mean, there are some models that are doing this, but the standard, types of solvers, are not really including these inclusions. And so when we do these fatigue tests in our laboratory and we see fractures, it may be related to processing. It may be related to inclusions that are in the material. So we need to also consider kind of like where we can right now go and where are the limitations on where we want to go when we're talking about true replacement.
Yeah. Thanks, Frank. Alex, hand up. Frankie?
This is fantastic. I mean, this discussion. I think what would be really useful. Again, I'm trying to come from the perspective of what next, right? Because you've done a lot of work with this step. What is the best way of putting our energy for the next step? And it might be that is, and also, sorry, what Tom is here as well. So, what is the best information and a set of recommendations that we can leave in the report of these particular pilots? So how can we hint into what direction of travel this panel or this group recommends? And one of the possibilities would be to have so what I learned today is there is this predicting in sort of physical testing versus virtual, predicting the same quantity or predicting the same decision is an important point. The second one would be the complexity of the models, as was said before, does not allow you perhaps to capture everything through modeling. But are there tests that to some extent, when you put them all together, they're redundant because some of the tests already cover that complexity that the models don't cover, while other tests add very little to what you have done on the previous test, in a sense. Is there a way that actually we can look at this not as replacing a test, but replacing a group of tests and overall getting the same information, therefore getting to the same decision? And then finally, is there a set of recommendations as well about for modelers, about what are the main areas where you would like to see more modeling work happening, because that will overcome some of the fundamental limitations of current modeling in terms of replacing physical testing, right? So some of those all of the three
Yeah.
ideas, I think would be.
Alex, on that last point, are you raising a question of sort of academic research in terms of developing technologies that would be able to capture some of the things like, as Ström's pointed out, inclusions and so forth, and just sort of further development of capabilities there?
Yeah, imagine that tomorrow the UK government and maybe some other governments aligned, puts a certain amount of money, X, and says, what do you want to do with this? What are the most pressing problems? Do we have a list about where to focus, right? Or the other way around. I mean, if we articulate what are the current limitations of the models, that may articulate why we need additional investment and why some of this investment cannot come from industry. Sorry, why some of this research cannot come from industry, right? And needs to come from the public sector as well. And why that will be transformational, because the risk is that if what we say, again, looking at the next steps, if what we say is, yeah, we need more research in general, that doesn't become appealing for someone who is trying to develop growth and actually, have inflection points in the way that we regulate we adopt In-Silico. But if we actually say, look, there is actually 2 or 3 Achilles points, and if we fix them, that will make a massive transformation in terms of adoption, in terms of reduction in cost, in terms of time to market, in terms of more thoroughness. I was yesterday in an event where I was again talking about In-Silico methods, and someone was telling me we don't need to worry, we don't need to focus so much in trying to save money, because probably in the bigger scheme, or even time sometimes, because in the bigger scheme of things, you may end up having an equivalent investment. But if what you can do is much more thorough information, or much more thorough, you can do things now with modeling that you will never be able to do, and actually we know are connected with failure modes, then that in itself might be already a good reason. So understanding what are the things that would lead to saving in time, what are the things that will align with saving in money, and what are the things that will enable new functionality and capability that we cannot do today. So, sorry, I know I put a lot of things there, but if we could, in the write-up of some of these, maybe reflect in some of these views, and because you are of the first few pilots, we could also have the opportunity to develop some small surveys that we can run through the community. What we need is to capture, do a bit of a crowdsourcing of intelligence about where as a community we think we should be going. I'll shut up.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think as part of Tom's write-up, incorporating some of what Jeff said into that, and where is the industry heading, right? So it's an area of active development. You could say it's beyond academic research, right? This is an area where Jeff's saying, hey, we have great confidence that we can make these absolute predictions. So I don't know, Jeff, eventually if there's a presentation, or if we just kind of cite this as an activity for now, if there's something more concrete that we can incorporate in the report, I definitely agree that makes sense. And I don't know, Jeff, if they're, sorry, I keep saying your name, Jeff. So Payman too, and then I see John on the call, others. Is there a publication out there that summarizes some of what Alex is speaking to? I know we have the VBUQ book coming up, and there may be some content in there around the chapter from Jeff Brandon and Walter Schmidt. Maybe some of that content would be appropriate in this report. That's something that we should definitely be able to share by the time the final report's written up from HRA. I think, Jeff, you had a really nice chapter in there. I don't know if that's something we share privately with Alex just for now, just so you can take a look at it and see if it starts to answer a few of those questions. But I don't know. Yeah, what do others think?
I definitely think we could have this discussion in the final report. I really think we need to do it more, right? And the point in the book chapter, Mark, was really we ought to be developing these methods in parallel, because both methods benefit from having the exchange of information. If we'd have been doing simulation 30 years ago as we are now, there are many methods, just looking at methods in my space, that would have been a heck of a lot better because of the feedback. And so, although I don't want to overstate how fast the contact analysis standards are going, this is a slow process. It is a standards organization. These things do take time. We won't have anything out there by the time of the final report. However, it's very easy to imagine some opinions, right, that come from the discussion here, maybe some of the discussion in the other pilots, that the idea of co-developing methods is something we really ought to do. And the idea of laying out basic expectations of simulation in places where all the evidence would seem to indicate that simulation really is credible, that's also something we really probably ought to be doing.
Yep. I think something else you bring up, Jeff, that's reminding me of our kind of planning meetings that we had for this example was, because you mentioned the standards development process, something else that came up was recognition. So you're working within the ASTM community to develop this standard, but it was mentioned during the discussion that, for example, F1717 isn't a harmonized standard. So then how do we kind of address this issue as well? I don't know if that's something that's worth bringing up as part of the discussion or write-up, is how these types of things are addressed when it comes to using modeling and simulation, or even just a standardized, what I thought was a standardized bench test across, other geographies.
Can I also make a comment on maybe set the perspective straight that the tests are models too, right? The bench tests, they are models because they are coming out of this is your interpretation of a recipe. And all the interlab studies have showed significant difference between different organizations' interpretation of that, even with the same device. They have consistently way different results. So if repeatability is one of the goals, right, and that's been devoted the case, I can go back to 1717. People have done sensitivity studies and then we just start tweaking, all these little tiny things that we never thought about. Oh, that starts matter, right? And that come from experience, and actually some of them come from back from the simulation. So if the repeatability is an endpoint, because we know it's not clinically relevant in a sense, right? This data is not, and as they don't claim it's clinically relevant, is repeatability being an endpoint? Is simulation better at that than a benchtop, right? And if the simulation can predict the whole domain of the physics of that phenomenon. So those are the two things I think maybe the metrics for the value and the challenge. The rigor, and the fidelity to reality. And we know reality in this case for simulation is benchtop, and the reality of benchtop is this written instruction on a piece of paper how to do something, which we know ends up to be two different and end up with different interpretation of even that, right? So just keep that with that in mind.
Yeah, Payman, to add on to those, I think those comments, certainly as we list out, and to Alex's question and general idea, I think it'd be useful to put together a set of criteria, for various simulations that would identify what type of simulation of a test is going to be valuable versus some other characteristics that might indicate that simulation is not going to be valuable. So setting up some criteria, and the point about weaknesses of certain tests I think is important as well. And Payman, that's what I hear out of what you're saying right now is the comments of tests are models, and we should be very clear about what the limitations of those tests might be relative to the actual physiological or clinical scenario. So I think it's important to list those as well, and just have that concept for where the tests fall short. And to add on to that comment with respect to where the tests fall short, and bringing it back or bringing in the concept of in silico clinical trials where you might be simulating a more realistic anatomy, you might be incorporating patient variability, you might be incorporating a number of other clinically relevant conditions that aren't present in the test. For the community as a whole, I think it's going to be valuable to have the comparisons between what an in silico clinical trial type analysis for a given product would show versus what a test method is going to show. I think that's kind of outside the scope of this particular pilot activity, of course, but I think the community should be focusing on where standardized methods and how they compare to in silico scenarios as we get more examples of in silico trials and more quote realistic applications of the modeling in quote realistic physiological scenarios, because just laying out those differences where again, it's just a modeling comparison, but showing how really illustrating with the modeling results how a clinical digital twin, or whatever language you want to use, results is going to compare to a benchtop test that people might be comfortable with, is going to likely be powerful motivation for the additional information that simulation can bring to the table.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I see Alex, you threw some links into the chat. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is a couple of very different things. One is coming from NIST about virtual measurements that I think will be useful for some of our colleagues from MPL here in the call. And the other one is a paper from a philosopher that we are actually trying to get for one of our future sessions, webinars, that is going to be looking at the epistemics of measurements, where they try to reflect on the difference between a measurement and a simulation as well, or a prediction from a simulation. Is a bit to complement some of the things that were said in the before. I just wonder, I don't know if any of our colleagues from the regulatory bodies, or if we have some of the colleagues from the approved bodies or notified bodies, have anything that they would like to sort of add to this, and whether this would be useful at all, these sort of discussions that we were having before about creating these minimum simulation requirements. Is that the sort of things that would help to advance, the adoption, to advance the sort of the knowing how to use these tools from a regulatory point of view, I mean?
Nice question, Alex. I like it.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
I know, yeah.
That's why I'm dropping it openly. I'm so glad that Ashley came.
No, I mean, I obviously don't assess this information as part of a conformity assessment. So my use of such data is limited. I think my view on it is that I'm relatively agnostic as to how the safety and performance of the product is demonstrated. And so when you asked a question earlier about who's the key driver for this, I was thinking initially it would be obviously the manufacturers trying to make a saving in terms of time and money, or make the most of their experience and expertise. And then I was also thinking from a patient perspective, how this can be leveraged to benefit them. And that's where perhaps it could be best leveraged to assess failure modes and to focus on the issues that matter most to them, which could be really novel devices where benchtop testing just is not in a place where it can be used effectively to test those products. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer for you, because ultimately what I want to see is the best possible products being placed on the market. And for that to occur, the methods used to test them needs to be as close to clinically relevant as possible. And that comes into the discussion about how the In-Silico testing maps onto the F1717 testing, and where F1717 sits. It's been touched on already that F1717 isn't used to confirm or demonstrate validation to an intended purpose. It's a comparative standard. And so I guess the principle there is that the device that an F1717 product is being tested against is already validated and has been used and is demonstrated to be safe and effective. And the benchtop testing is demonstrating that the device is mechanically similar. So yeah, there's a few thoughts there just about the broader validation of these models and the importance of the clinical relevance aspect. But yeah, ultimately, I think my perspective is that I'm all for as many test methods as possible to open up options to as many manufacturers as possible to put their products through the system. I can just see that the in-silico methods are extremely complicated and very technical, and I think we need better expertise or access to expertise to understand the implications of the results, and to ensure that the decisions we make as regulators are as close to safe decisions as possible.
Yep, thanks, Ashley. Toro, and yeah, Ashley, just following up there, I agree with you completely. That's where things like V&V40, I think, help. There's a lot of things that you can build into a computational model. One of the things that we like to say, and I learned early on in my V&V journey, is complexity does not equal fidelity. And so just because you have this amazingly complex model, it doesn't mean you've captured the real world physics. So that's where hopefully the discussions here around, V&V, uncertainty quantification, et cetera, help to kind of guide the model developer and then provide the kind of information that you need to assess, yeah, this person has actually followed some best practices and put some thought and effort into, what really establishes the credibility of the model. Yeah. So thanks for that. I appreciate it.
So Mark, I just wanted to.
Well, Toro had his hand up, but then it maybe
Okay.
went away. I'm not sure, he disappeared. Sorry. Toro, comment? We can't hear you if you are saying something. Now you're muted. Now unmuted. Let's see. There we go. Perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'll come from the perspective of one of the certification bodies, as Ashley had said as well. So thanks. The presentation was good. I'm also someone coming from an in-silico background. I was doing computer models 20 years ago of hip joint replacements and so on, and so I see the real benefit in all of this. But then again, being on the other side as well, on the regulatory side, one of the key things for us, we perform our assessments on the basis of whatever standards or regulations are there, and so whatever the standards dictate what it is, or the regulations dictate what it is that we look at. And I think in Ashley's point at the end there, it says, it's important to have the background, the competence within the regulatory bodies that can understand the models, that can understand the benefits of these. That isn't always present, because I know how many number of times I've ended up arguing with so many of my colleagues whenever I've seen computer models being used. And just to say, it's yes, we can move forward from this. But the key thing is, for the regulators, it's important that we have that there's confidence in the models, in the modeling and the predictions, and then there's a solid rationale for the decisions that you're making to either choose that, whether it's the model or for the decision that you're making to move forward with a particular design, or for making any conclusions. But ultimately, at the end of it, it must be backed up with data. We cannot. I don't think the regulators, we're comfortable at this point to say that the in-silico models will replace testing or replace real live information, but it can be used as a complementary or additional data for any model, for whether it's clinical data or testing data or anything like that. So you need to be able to use that as a complementary tool to whatever data that to whatever is being shown. But the key thing is getting the confidence in the modeling as well, and the understanding to the regulators. And if these things get translated into standards, it becomes much more easily accepted.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And Srin, I'm going to jump ahead of you. I apologize. So, Vittorio, you bring up A good point. So here's the question I want to ask. So if I had one wish, I'm not going to say I would use this wish on this thing, but if I had one wish and I said, I want V&V40 to be globally recognized by every regulator starting May 22nd at midnight. Okay. Are you saying, and maybe would the consensus be, oh, wow, we have this internationally recognized standard. Is that the problem, or would the problem then be shift to we don't have anybody who can review these submissions? Like, yeah, we accept it. I don't know who did that, but suddenly now we live in a world where V&V40 is globally recognized. Do the notified bodies and regulatory agencies around the world have the staff that then are able to assess these models if we are in fact in compliance with the V&V40 standard?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think again, it's similar to it's similar to the way we do the assessments, right? There are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of devices, medical devices out there that need a wide variety of expertise to look at it and understand it. And I think it's the same thing that would apply in this situation, because yes, fair enough. Okay, there's this V&V standard. We should be able to understand computational modeling, and we should be accepting this. But each device is different. It's a different type of device, different type of materials, different type of parts of the anatomy that is being used, etc., etc., etc. And so you need the additional skills and expertise for those people. So it will take time for that to come in. Yeah.
Yep.
And
Ashley?
I can add to that, which is if manufacturers started submitting documents tomorrow because of this magical circumstance, I guess notified bodies and approved bodies are businesses, and they would see the demand increase and therefore start justifying expertise internally. And the competent authorities would be seeking external expertise from their market leading experts to get that immediate expertise. And then again, if it became a norm, then that would justify headcount internally to support that. So the regulatory bodies adjust to the state of the art science at the time. And so, yes, an overnight change would challenge us, but a gradual change in the market in terms of the scientific maturity of these areas would ultimately change the competence of.
Got it. I'm not sure if we lost Ashley or if I lost you all because of my video. Sharon, I see your head moving, so maybe I'm still online. Is that true? Can you hear me?
We can still hear you, Mark. Yep.
Okay. All right. But Ashley, just so you know, we got all the way to the end. I think you just got choppy at the very end. So I really appreciate your comment there. Thank you. Sharon, now finally, yeah, you're up. If you still have a comment.
Yeah, it might have passed. I was just going to mention, Mark, and I don't know if it's worth mentioning because we're talking about the kind of the regulatory part of this. There was the successes and opportunities paper, white paper that was published, right, about modeling simulation, at least on the FDA side, right, and it talks about some of these things, right. It highlights essentially where are the opportunities, or I guess you can call them, where are currently the limitations and where we need to move. So I think there's been some obviously discussion, and it ties in exactly what I'm hearing from from the EU and the UK, which is, of course, the expertise needs to be there as well within those different, agencies to help review this, because, it's not just FEA or computation, or CFD, but there's lots of different kinds of computational models out there, right? And so having that expertise is actually a pretty daunting task, right, for a regulatory body, but, they would, somehow get those resources to meet that, hopefully, but that is a challenge. Yes.
Yeah, maybe from a UK Center for Regulatory Science. Yeah, some such thing. It might be a good place to start.
Perhaps.
Other comments or questions? Getting near the end, but we still have 10 or so minutes left. If not, Alex, I don't know if you have a final wrap-up comment that you'd like to give. I think we're good. Sounds like we're good from the audience perspective. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's really, really good. All the discussion that was generated, the input from everyone. Maybe just a couple of things. Sorry, I'd like to give a heads up to Lara in the team if she wants to give a bit of an update on the next event that we have, or maybe that we have coming up, the next pilot. If any of you who has participated in the event wants to be sort of closely engaged because you found this useful, but you haven't been connected with the CEiRSI from the beginning, and you would like to find ways to contribute, there's another 8 pilots to come, and some of them are in the process of starting to do the preparation work. So I'm sure that there will be people with interested to engage and involve you. And also, if there are suggestions for either webinars or other pilots that we could consider, we are always open to those, because there is always opportunities to sort of develop things further. And also, if there are things that you feel we should have covered that we haven't covered, by all means, let us know as well.
All right, everyone. So with that, I really thank the team. The folks who contributed to this example, kudos, well done. Really enjoyed working with you. Hard part's done for us. We can relax now, but I do invite those of you too who are involved in this. I think, some of the expertise that we developed, I know Steve, you're helping out quite a bit with or involved in other, pilots as well. If you think you have something to contribute, definitely, I think we're going to grow and learn together as we go through this process. So thanks again to the audience. I see most of you all were able to stay for the entire time. So I definitely appreciate your time and attention on this. And we're looking forward to the next pilots and ultimately the conclusion of this project. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.